especially when they feel that they can get away with it. So in high crime areas, expect a lot of this violence to go on because they feel that they can get away with it.
Hi everyone, this is Arpad from Starpath Academy, and today we have a very special guest on. He is Fernando. He runs the YouTube channel The Modern Survivalist. He has a lot of good books on the subject, including the one that called Street Survival Skills that I'm looking forward to purchase soon. Also Bugging Out and Relocating, as well as the Modern Survival Manual. So I will have links to these books in the description. Please feel free to check them out on Amazon or wherever you can find it. Fernando has lived through the economic collapse of Argentina, and I wanted to invite him to the channel so he could share his experience during this collapse, what he learned from the collapse, and he's a wealth of knowledge, so let's hear him out. I have a couple of questions for him. With that said, thank you very much, Fernando, for coming on to the channel.
Thank you for having me.
I've been looking forward to talking to you. So I have a couple of questions because I personally don't know too much about the Argentinian situation back then. Could you give our viewers, a short or brief historical perspective of what triggered and how that economic collapse happened in Argentina, when it happened, and so on?
Sure. Well, it's a number of factors. It's not just one. These things are usually quite complex, not just one thing, but mostly it's an economy based on debt, just acquiring more and more debt nonstop internationally. Usually when people think of debt, it's, especially in the United States, individuals have debt. In the case of Argentina, the country was getting, more and more in debt, and they were doing that for many reasons, but one of those was to sustain an artificial parity with the US dollar. So an Argentine peso, so 1 peso in Argentina was 1 US dollar. So you could just go to a bank and exchange that, with if you made like 10,000 pesos a month as an executive or bank manager, you would just go and you would just get, $10,000. It was the exact same thing. You could change it in the bank. That was, of course, not very realistic because there was no way in which an Argentine peso was the same as a US dollar. But that created a very, strange situation by which everything was cheaper being brought from abroad. You just imported everything. It destroyed the national industry. National industry made no sense because with that kind of exchange rate, just buy everything from abroad. You would just travel United States and buy, 2 of everything because everything was cheap. Think of it like in the 90s, so you're talking about the average Argentine was making more money than the average guy working in US, in terms of middle class, if you look at it that way. This created a number of problems, but you were looking at high unemployment rates. Inflation is starting to creep in and getting worse. Finally, the country defaulted on its national debt. So it was unable to keep on making the payments of the debt it had acquired over the years, and it just said, enough. We were defaulting, and they froze everyone's bank accounts. So if you had an account with your life savings, didn't matter. It just got frozen and you couldn't access it. If you had money for surgery, so as to save your kid's life, didn't matter. Just couldn't have that anymore. And people lost everything, Later, they converted it to a new parity with a peso, which you basically wiped out like 60%, 70% of your earnings were all, and that was actual money. I mean, some people actually had, you went and you deposited 50,000 US dollars and they just kept that and gave you 20,000 pesos or whatever. So that, of course, created a serious problem. And all of this was also combined with the political problem because Argentina has a very sad political reality by which almost for the last 60, 70 years, the populist nationalist party of the Peronist party, Evita Perón and all that stuff, so all of these populists have perpetrated themselves over the decades, and they were actively trying to bring down the current government at that time, and this was just perfect for them. As soon as this started going down, they threw gasoline on the different protests across the country. Looting started across the country, and there was no way of controlling that. The police had no chance of stopping that. So by the 20th of January of December 2001, the country was in flames. So they started looting stores all around the place. The president resigned. The vice president became president and resigned himself. We famously went through 5 different presidents in a week. Just 1 week, 5 different presidents.
Wow.
Martial law was declared. Suspension of basic rights was enacted. You couldn't gather in more than 2 or 3 after 8 p.m. It was intense, to say the least. Yes.
Wow, that's a lot.
That's a lot, yeah.
A lot to consume. And I did try to make this point for my viewers before. When these collapses happened, including in Romania in the 90s, early 90s that we went through, it usually brings a political shift as well with it.
Yeah.
So that is sometimes even worse than the economical part, because radicalists on either side could be coming in, and things that you think have value or you own on paper, suddenly you find out that these could be taken away in an instant. So that's a lot. However, so you identified what actually happened. Were there any early indicators, a spark, something that, led maybe a couple of months, a week, or well, hopefully even a year, that would tell people, hey, something's going really bad? Because in the United States, I think the majority of the people are waiting on that one sure sign that will, okay, this happened. I have 6 months to prepare now, so I better get starting. So they always defer preparing to that later point that they think that they will be able to identify. Was there any like that? Usually there is, but it's hard to identify. I'm wondering, what was your situation?
Yeah, look, I've been doing this for almost over 10 years now. And I've never said this before, but I think you're reaching a breaking point where this is about, I mean, inflation is already terrible across the world, but specifically in the United States, it's quite bad. And you're looking at these lack of, empty shelves in UK, lines for fuel. You're getting to a point of a breaking point. In the United States, I'm looking at inflation as a big indicator. Look, when this happened, we saw rampant inflation just overnight. Prices double and triple. And this, what people don't quite get is this destroys. I mean, just imagine for a second if you had to live with half your income, because that's what happens when the same amount of money buys less stuff, you just become poorer. So imagine if you go to a store right now, imagine if you had to live with 1/3 of your income right now. Would you be poor then? Okay, then you're going to be poor if this happens to you. Would you be poor if you have to live with a quarter of your income? Then this is going to be happening, because that's what happens when all of a sudden a cereal box is going for $11. I picked up cereal boxes that were going for $11 in those days. It was quite incredible. So that's what people don't quite get. Now, as indicators, you're seeing them all. I mean, the way in which employment, well, in the case of Argentina, you saw this 1-to-1 conversion rate, which was unsustainable. So it was just a huge pocket of debt, constant debt. Now, one of the key differences in the United States, which went down just right now, is U.S. has also been living out of pure debt constantly. I mean, it's an ever increasing fantasy of just, we're going to be printing more money, and it's a huge amount of debt. Now, it was always the case that the United States had this stick. U.S. has always been the guy with a gun in the world, the big military. Now, that has also reached a point of no return, by which, well, that actually doesn't seem to be as efficient as it used to be in the past, or as important as we thought it was, because with what you saw in Afghanistan right now, what good did it do? I mean, if you cannot defeat is these people living in the mountains with old AK-47s and walking around in sandals, then what is it you're going to be doing against China, Russia, or pretty much anyone else? How efficient and how much leverage do you have with all those guns, planes, bombs, and so on? So the leverage is being lost. And what's happening is that this illusion, this curtain of illusions being lifted, and people are seeing things now for the first time. Once this happens, it gets scary. Look, this is the same thing as when you have a bank run. This is what happened in Argentina. You were asking me before about things that you saw like a year before or a day before. Well, a year before you could see, yeah, this, the unemployment is very high. You see poverty getting worse, and you see this unrealistic economy and a lack of capability of paying back the debt you had. So all of those are clear indicators. Now, just a few days before, you saw that you couldn't get money out of the banks. You went to the banks, and right. This happened to me. We went, and my parents both are accountants, so they're knowledgeable about economic things and such. And we try to close an account with $1,000, and they told us, we don't have that money. We don't have $1,000 in it. And we were like, you don't have $1,000 in the bank? No, you have to go to the main branch. And we went to the main branch. The following day, they closed the bank. Yeah, they froze. Yeah, they actually physically closed the bank. They just closed the curtain, and you just couldn't get your money out of there or make any transactions. You had a very small limit for your ATM withdrawals as well. That's also an important tip. Keep a good amount of cash at hand in spite of the inflation. Now, for example, my mother-in-law, she went to the bank with my wife and asked about, are things okay? Because we're hearing these rumors about, bank runs and the manager of the bank told her, don't worry, those are all silly rumors. The following day, in spite of telling her to her face that nothing was going to be happening, the following day, they closed the bank. They knew that was going to be happening. So you have to, if you have someone on the inside, if you have someone that has those connections, that can be very valuable, and talk with them constantly. Don't just take their word for it, because they may not be, unless they're very close friends or family, it may just tell you, everything is fine when it's not.
Yeah, they are instructed to do that, in fact.
Yeah.
So
correct.
yeah, you can't pay attention of what they are telling you. You have to pay attention what they are doing. Hopefully
Right,
find that out, especially if they are a higher position. So very well put, that you start to feel these stresses on the current system, and things don't work as good as it used to. That's something that you took for granted, that you can just go to the bank and take out your money. Suddenly they're asking you why you're taking out your money, or it's limited, and just in very subtle things at first, until the last day, everything is still fine until it's not, and it's immediately not. That was very similar to our case, and even when I talked with persons from other countries as well who went through this. So thank you very much. You touched upon social unrests and protests, and could you just a little bit more detail share what actually happened? What was something that how you could prepare for that? What was a good thing to do? What were places not to be? Just so which you share some knowledge with the viewers of how to not predict these things, but have a good reaction when if at all something like this would happen.
They can certainly be quite dangerous, and there's gonna be I've been doing this for a very long time, and I've kept on learning over the years. This is what I do basically all day long for a living. This is as a in the movie 300, where they say this is my profession. Well, this is my profession. I do this, and it's a lot more complex than sometimes people realize. For example, I can tell you right away that even though I was in the middle of I've been in so many of these episodes of they just block the street, or they start looting. I was just just pushing my shopping cart, and they start looting around me, and I just keep on with my life. It got to the point where that became almost normal. I remember being there a few times, and they all of a sudden, the employees start running around making barricades, and you just quickly buy the last few things you need, and you just take off, and they start. I've seen firsthand how the manager of a store goes and tries to negotiate, like we'll give you this stuff, just don't destroy everything. And they kind of have an arrangement with them, and they give them a food and stuff, and they leave. Sometimes they just want to just loot everything and destroy everything and just trash the place. Now, in the case of the United States, there's another component that you have to keep in mind, which is the racial tension, political prejudice, and all of this stuff that does not apply to a place like Argentina, where I knew I was not going to be getting bashed over the head because of the color of my skin. So all of these things you have to keep it in mind. Now, you see very strange things like the constant going up of prices. You want to avoid maybe some of the more crowded areas. Of course, we were just seeing it in South Africa. Have you seen the recent looting over there? It gets very violent.
Yeah.
You still see a lot of violence on the street, and you see a lot of stealing, looting, and paybacks and just random acts of violence, which just don't make any sense, but that's how people are, especially when they feel that they can get away with it. So in high crime areas, expect a lot of this violence to go on because they feel that they can get away with it. So on those cases, you want to stay put, stay home. Now, this may end up going on for a while. In my case, in Argentina, this went on for months. I mean, months later, after all of this went down, every once in a while, they would just, go after a store, and they would just loot the place. I was just, like having lunch with my coworkers, working in an office hours, and, running to get a quick bite. And all of a sudden, you saw a mob of people going down the street, and you're like, oh yeah, there they go. And it's life as normal. And they just do this. Yeah, you basically want to stay away from it. You want to avoid, especially when there's roadblocks. Those can be quite dangerous as well. People get agitated. We saw how they attack drivers, or people get nervous and drive over them. So all of these things you want to be aware of. Avoid them as much as you can. But if it ends up coming down to that, keep on moving. Don't stop, because you may get pulled out of your car and just lynched right there on the street.
You touched on a couple of interesting points that one has to be aware of his surroundings, his cultural setting, and know what are the existing stress points already in a working society, because usually those are the fissure lines that will break when society has a harder time. And that brings up a interesting topic of the gray man, right? When people talk about one-on-one encounters is one thing, but people who maybe even dealt with this or see it in movies, it's a totally different mentality of the mob mentality that's going on, right? And because you can individually make deals with a person, right? And you can be reasonable, but the mob mentality is completely different. So it was interesting to hear that store managers would try this approach, which would work with one person. Hey, just take it, I'm fine, just don't destroy stuff or don't hurt me. But the mob doesn't have a brain like that. It has its own psychology, and as you pointed, probably the best thing is to not be there, so that or be invisible probably. So could you talk about the concept of two things actually? One is the gray man, and one is strategic relocation, because I know you talk about this on your channel. Could you expand upon these two concepts, please?